Shit. We're on. I'm excited for this one. This is gonna be good. Woke up, nice ice cold shower this morning. Ice cold calibrates me. Calibrated. I jazzercised. Today was leg day. I'm tired. I got a thing of water. I want to do this video about my path to finding the path of enlightenment, spirituality, self-actualization, really whatever you want to call it. I feel like it's going to give this channel a little bit more context to what I want to be doing. And throughout, I'm going to be touching on, a few anecdotes here and there, a few lessons that I learned, but more so it's just about, it's like story time. It's just kind of like story time. Because I wasn't always like this. I definitely was not always... I couldn't have imagined getting to the point of where I am now. But we'll get to all that. And, yeah, I might as well just start with, like, the beginning. Just me as a kid. Being a baby's weird. Especially being a conscious baby. I always felt like I felt a lot. I was very aware of how much I felt. I felt the feedback loop of myself just like strong within me. And I was always incredibly empathetic. I cried at the end of both Short Circuit movies when I thought Johnny Five died, who was a robot for anybody that doesn't know. I cried whenever I saw piñatas getting beat up. I was always the mediator in family arguments, ever since I was like 6 or 7 years old. But conversely, I also had a lot of anger in me, a lot of frustration. And at the time, I got a goddamn finger... It was a fingernail I was chewing on. I didn't realize prior to starting. I should have got rid of the fingernail before I started this. But I digress. Whew, you gotta go slow. You just gotta relax and go slow. I rush. That's another thing. I've spent most of my life rushing, flying, wanting to get to the end. I had no patience. No patience. And now I have to finally come to terms with that. And it's just hilarious. So coming back to the frustration, I didn't know where that frustration was coming from. And I went to Catholic grade school and high school. My dad was a police officer for years. He was and still is very angry. So I was raised around that authoritarian energy, that objective right and wrong, that God and the devil. Just the epitome of believing in the separation, in this illusion of separation. And then that started to spill over onto me, and it affected the way that I started to view people and see people. And then I would get filled with this righteous indignation and this this people are sinners and God will smite them and I will enjoy watching them suffer because it is just. And I couldn't... At the same time, I still was very compassionate, and I loved people, and I was that mediator at the same time. And I couldn't reconcile those things, because when I did believe in that lowercase God that I was taught, it was still a loving being. And I was full of conflict for years. And that conflict started to spill over to the way that I viewed myself. And then I started to be filled with this anger and self-hatred and self-loathing for myself. And this just depressed, woe is me attitude, and just turned into this neediness that existed for years. And I was always concerned with how I was being viewed. And I wanted people to like me and love me. And then that becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy. And then people see that, and they almost give you the results that you were expecting to get. And then I was using that as almost evidence for why I was right the whole time. And it's like, I knew I was a piece of shit. But somewhere in my mind, I knew that I was worthy, and I knew that I could get out of this. And I did in the end, of course. Yes. But it took quite some time. It took a while. And because I was conscious, because I had a few conscious teachers, because I was aware enough to see what was going on around me, I started to be like, something's not right here. There's this anger that is in the church, that is in authority, doesn't compute with how loving it's supposed to be. And around my senior year in high school, I essentially became an atheist very quickly. Right before that, though, like for about a week and a half, I had this, what I consider to be one of the first authentic thoughts of my own. The idea that whatever people believed in would wind up being the case. Almost as if reality was so infinitely powerful, whatever you believed in would be what you were given. Which is ironic that it is kind of similar to what I feel like it actually is. But I felt like that wasn't practical. And because I was moving towards this pragmatic place, I don't know if I mentioned the spiral dynamics, I did in a few different takes, but yes. So coming from that blue part of the spiral, that authoritarian, religious, objective right and wrong, moving into that orange part of the spiral, that pragmatic part of it, that progress, things that I can prove empirically. So because that thought didn't make sense to me, I essentially passed it and just went to atheism. And I spent years there. I spent about a decade there being an atheist. And so this was what really started to break the ground for me is maybe 4 years into my atheism, I came across determinism, or hard determinism, or the idea that essentially free will does not exist. Everything is infinitely causally determined. And while I did believe that, I didn't integrate it. I wasn't able to integrate it. I couldn't see the implications in it yet. So I essentially just kind of kept it in the back of my mind. And I was very distracted by my own life. And another way that this neediness presented itself in my life was with women and with the girls that I liked. And, all right, we're going to have to cut here because I'm going to have to take a look at whatever this says because this is an important part. And beginning now. Remember, remember, done is better than perfect. That's another thing I need to remind myself. Matthew, done is better than perfect. Shit. I want to start off with what's the most ironic about, and why this is in the story to begin with. It's because when I learned about masculine and feminine energy and why my neediness was repelling away all the women that I was interested in, and why my happiness could not be contingent on whether or not I wound up with a specific person, and that women can instinctively feel that and see that almost as like an evolutionary trait. I didn't realize I was simultaneously learning about detachment. I was also learning about life and learning about enlightenment and what ultimately led to this path. And my neediness, so I was that typical nice guy. And it manifested in all the typical nice guy behavior of just, literally being nice, of course, but also constantly needing affirmations, texting too much because you're afraid that they're going to lose interest. What's ironic about being needy is even if you get that those affirmations, you don't believe it yourself. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how much love you get from the outside. If you don't have any of that love for yourself, it's never going to take root. And even more ironic, if you had already had that, you wouldn't have been even out there looking for it to begin with. It's crazy. It's perfect. Again, perfect problem that life is. And it's funny because about the ego, because that typical nice guy stereotype is the ego. I didn't know that at the time because I didn't realize the scope because the ego is the entire negative side of the spectrum. It's not that typical, male posturing, this just taking up all the space in the room kind of thing. Ego is also that self-loathing. It's that neediness. Got off track a bit. Hold on, what else did I say? Sabotaging myself. I was sabotaging myself for years and I didn't even know why. And that happened until I was 28 years old. And I didn't start to come out of that until I was 28. And every time I would sabotage myself. And then after a while you start to get resentful. And then you get angry at at women and yourself. And then it's that vicious cycle. And something has to give at some point. You have to get like the right kind of frustrated. You have to get consciously frustrated to the point where you want to improve yourself. And then you realize through the process of improving yourself and through being detached, you don't actually need the relationship to begin with. Perfect irony. Perfect irony, perfect problem. Because I knew I was always deserving of that love. And we know that we're deserving of that love, which is why it's almost like all these parts of us exist inside of ourselves, but none of them really know about each other. They're just all coming to head up here in the mind. So it's up to our conscious to almost inform those other parts of ourselves. I'm like, look, I know you feel this way right now, but this side of you that's the devil, that is the ego, doesn't know that you're fine. It's just trying to work its way into you so it can get its actions to express itself through you. Because it wants to be satisfied. It's not working in your best interest because it has its own interest, as the ego does. And it's interesting too, because nobody could have explicitly told me that about that masculine and feminine energy. Women wouldn't have known that because it's just instinctual. They couldn't sit me down and say, you're being needy, you need to have your own direction for yourself. Your happiness cannot be contingent on whether or not you are with me or anybody else, because they didn't know that. And again, just instinctual. And even some guys, if they start to like get it right with women for a little while, it might be a false positive. And then that's where you get advice like, oh, you just need to treat them like assholes, just like act like you don't care and then they're gonna like you. Which is a little short of the answer, because you might have that detachment down, you might have that drive in yourself down, but you don't have that emotional connection. That you have that detachment, but you don't have that detachment enough to maintain that long-term relationship. Or if there's history with each other and two people kind of want to be together just because they've been together for the entire time and things fall apart, then you get a codependent relationship. And then it just starts to turn toxic, and then it takes years to figure that shit out because you want to be with somebody. And when you want to be with somebody for the sake of you just feeling good about yourself, you're missing the point. You're missing the point. I missed the point for quite some time. But I'm out now, haha, hot shit kid, where are we? So yeah, I stayed in that atheistic, logical, empirical mindset for quite some time. Again, until I was around 28, once everything started to kind of change. When I was 25, however, I met this girl who was on vacation down here. I was living in Florida at the time because eventually I left Philadelphia because I just got fed up and frustrated running away from your problems, which your problems are ultimately coming from inside of you. What also is ironic about going somewhere to find out you never had to leave that place to begin with is the same metaphor as us as a higher being incarnating into these bodies only to discover once we got here we never needed to come here to begin with. But I digress. So yes, I met this girl and I had the strongest connection that I had felt with anybody else. And I felt a lot of energy from her, and she saw how conscious I was before I saw it. And once she went home, I kind of had this drive like I've never had before. Because at the time, I didn't want to be with anybody besides her. So any other girl that I was looking at, I just wasn't interested in. I was only concerned with focusing on myself. So I didn't understand the mechanics, again, of masculine and feminine energy. I was just kind of doing what was intuitive. It's like, well, she's gone right now. I don't know what to do. I want to be with her, yes, but I don't know what else to do. So I just was like, I'm just going to work on myself. And I started to, this is when I came back around to determinism, and I started integrating it into my life. I started to actually see the implications of it. I started to begin to see my life as the result of every day that I have lived up till that point. I saw the causal chain of events that led me to being who I was. And I started to, what's great about that is you start to forgive other people because you see them as being, oh my God, you're just stuck in your own ignorance. You just can't get out of it. You're so ignorant of your own ignorance. I can't get mad at you because you just don't even know what you're doing. And then you can also forgive yourself by extension because you realize you didn't know what you were doing the whole time. It's like, oh God, I'm so lost. And it all hits you at once. It blows your mind because you're like, what now? Now what am I going to do? And it's like, well, I started to get into health, into fitness, into... My logic was, if the things I was doing are not up to me, what do I have to do to make those things up to me? And I'm like, well, it comes down to everything. It comes down to diet. It comes down to sleep. It's like, today is contingent on how I lived yesterday and is contingent on the day before and so on and so forth. So yeah, I started getting in that mood, started focusing on myself, but as always, life happens and it throws us off. And that's another thing I realized in this work. It takes a couple times. It takes a couple times to stick. Just like coming back to some of the trips that I have had, which I'm going to have to touch on. Tripping takes practice. You need to work your way up to it. You can't just do, well, I'll get around to that later. But yeah, you need to practice. So I got lost. I got lost in life, got frustrated, and I moved to Denver when I was 28. And I didn't know what I was looking for when I moved there, but I absolutely found it. And I had lived with my parents for basically my entire life. And I knew I was comfortable. I knew I wasn't really going to force myself to make progress unless I threw myself into the place where I knew I would, all right, 11 minutes. I would force myself to make the changes. Take away your safety net. And that's kind of the level that I'm back on now. Because where I'm at now, all the teachings and things that I've realized are kind of coming to a head at once. And as you realize all these things, it's like, well, I had this, but this part here was down here. I realized both these things, but I can't maintain and hold them all up at once. It's almost like a weird kind of juggling. Think about it like this. It's like juggling. That the objects that you are juggling, the more that you are juggling, the less time each one spends with you in your hands. So it's almost like, all right, how do I reduce the amount of things that I'm juggling into being simple enough to, it's like, oh, this is easy. Oh, I can spend, until eventually you realize that everything you're juggling is just one thing in the end. And then you're holding that one thing. And then you're like, oh, I can bring this anywhere. I don't have to throw this up in the air to have it be with me because now it stays with me. Beautiful. Moved to Denver. I moved to Denver and it was great. About a year and a half into Denver, I got into the first relationship that I had ever been in and the only one that I've still been in so far. And that's when things really started to change for me. Because up until that point, I was always good at being a mediator, at kind of giving some semblance of relationship advice, but I was never able to really be in one myself. I don't know if I was afraid of commitment, but it was easy now because I was committing to everything. I was just in a good vibration. I was doing intense breath work. Learned about Wim Hof. Started Wim Hofing my ass off. And it's funny because throughout doing that, I was like, oh, you can feel this way without like doing anything. You don't need to fucking smoke or drink or eat mushrooms. You can just, and you do it for a while and you're like, oh my God, this is beautiful. So yes. Making it up. Yeah. Perfect. Once the relationship started, I started to get a lot more open to spirituality than I had ever been before. And I think a lot of what determinism did for me was open up the door to the possibility of God, ironically enough. Because this meant, okay, if it is infinite and essentially the only thing that is determining anything from happening is if there is some kind of mechanic in place to manifest that, then who am I to say what can or can't be manifested if there's some kind of mechanic that I'm unaware of? Maybe there was some kind of aspect to belief in life that you had to have the belief in it before it kind of came to you. And once that door started to open, I started to step into it. And the first taste of oneness that I ever got, so this is intense. This was the most amazing experience, one of the most amazing experiences I've ever had. Me and the girl who I was in a relationship with, we ate some acid, and it got to this point where we were both peaking, and I was staring into her eyes, and it started to feel like I was literally her. It felt like I was herself looking into a mirror at herself. And the boundary between me and her started to evaporate. And I started to get this incredibly inquisitive look on my face. I was just being blown away by what I was experiencing. And shortly before this is when I started to get into Leo at actualize.org. I owe a lot to his teachings. I started to learn more about strange loops, about infinite recursion, about us being a strange loop, about us being everything. And I was on the verge of physically experiencing that. And every time I got this look in my eye, looking at her, she would get this look on her face. And every time I thought about all of reality and life being one thing, it was reflected inside of her, almost like I was giving it to her with my mind. And it was just this vicious cycle. And it kept building. And then she said up until this day, the most beautiful thing anybody has ever said to me, it's the expression you wear when I see you. And I started crying immediately. Because this meant the way that she saw me in her mind's eye was this inquisitive look, this love, this unconditional love that I had. Me without ego, without ulterior motive, just my being. And that's when I really started to get the feeling of what true love was. And I was like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever experienced. And it was great. And I think about that time often. And I still bring that with me. In the end, it ended. But it ended very amicably. And we are still friends today. And shortly after that relationship ended is when when I finally stepped through that door. I had my first Egodeath experience from about 7 grams of mushrooms, 50 milligrams of edibles, THC, and like 3 dabs in a row. And I just sat back against the wall. And I don't know where, closed my eyes, I don't know where my consciousness went to, but I woke up and I was in the middle of crying. And I heard myself in my head almost welcome myself. I heard myself say, there he is. Like I was waiting for myself to get there. And it was fucking nuts. And it was beautiful. And immediately, everything that seemed like theory at the time, everything that I had been practicing, I was being it. And it was everything made sense. All of life and death made sense. Non-duality made sense. The oneness of life made sense. The beautiful irony in life was perfect. It was beautiful. It was great. Happy day. So I spent the rest of that day essentially just ruminating on those discoveries and just, oh my God, this is beautiful. As life does, and as with the discoveries I made in the past, life comes back and it steps in and you realize a lot of, and this is when I realized that like life is a practice and almost like tripping is a practice. You need to work your way up to it to bring the realization back with you into your relatively sober life. To realize, yeah, you're feeling it now, but you are going to come down. And when you come down, how are you going to be? Are you going to be the way that you were before? Or are you going to keep this truth with you? And I was able to really keep that truth with me. But I realized I brought it back into a world of ego, into a world of separation. And then I started to have to come to terms with where I was in life. I was in the cannabis industry. I had a great time there. But I also was like, oh, there's ego here too. And I'm like, oh God, how do I reconcile these things? And I'm going to do a separate video on my challenges after Enlightenment, or like during Enlightenment, right before, and the challenges that you have to face afterwards, because they're similar, but they're essentially different to the challenges that you face in everyday life, because they can get paradoxical, and a lot of it usually just comes back to detachment. So in the end, well, actually, so what happened is a guy blew up my house in Denver. This is a long story. Maybe I'll tell that story some other time. But yeah, straight up blew my house up. I was getting home from work. I pulled into the driveway in the back alley, and I heard this explosion. And I have a lot of end of the world dreams where I die very often, so I'm kind of ready to die all the time. It sounded like a fucking train was driving through that house. I didn't know what was happening, but I was like, just make it quick. Just make it quick. And I lived in the end. I was about to walk in. Yeah, I could be dead right now, but it doesn't matter. Really, aren't we all dead anyway all the time? Really, isn't life and death just the same thing? I'm just kidding. I mean, I'm serious, but this is what's interesting about having the self-awareness about being on this level, because kind of comes back. You know what? I'm gonna digress. I don't want to have to dive into all that. Keep it together, Matthew. Keep it together. So yeah, I came back here. I came back here not too long ago. And I've essentially just been trying to reconcile being unconditionally happy, realizing I'm it, and talking about it, and wanting to bring that to other people, and teach people and lead people through this experience. But they have to want to go through it. And then you kind of think about, God damn it, what is it? Consent. Consent is beautiful. Not just like, we usually think about consent in the sexual form. This is consent, like spiritual consent. It's almost like I didn't want all this. I didn't want you to have to open my eyes to all of this. And what's beautiful about it is if you're not ready to receive it, it's just going to sound like I'm crazy, which is fine. It's just, which is another good thing about doing this on YouTube, is because people can come to it if they want to see it, unless, you're a masochist and you just want to watch people that piss you off. And there's certainly no shortage of those people around. But we're on a ride. We're on a ride, and I feel good. And I don't think there's anything else that I wanted to talk about. I kind of bounced around a lot with what I was doing, but I think I kind of got the gist of everything. So it's good. It's good. Yeah, shit, kids. I love it. This was fun. This was good. Be happy with yourselves as best you can be. And detach, and yeah, just fuck it. We're fine. We're already whole. We have nowhere to be. We are already perfect. So yeah, that's it for this. I love you all. I kind of don't want to say goodbye. That's weird. And it's not that I feel like I'm not done, but it's like I don't want to have to go yet. And I feel that metaphor in... All right, one more quick drop. So I maybe about a month and a half ago, I had a really hard trip, and I felt like I was told by whatever it is, look, we can pull you out now. You've essentially learned everything you have to by doing this over and over again. We can pull you out now, but if we do, you're done forever. The cycle of life and death is over. You're going back to source energy. And there was this, like, I was faced with my own death, and I was like, I don't want to go yet. There's still more that I want to do. I'm not ready to go yet. In addition to that, it was also this idea that once you go there, you're going to be given some degree of power that's infinitely greater than anything you've experienced on Earth. And I realized I still have a lot of attachments. I still have a lot. Not a lot. I have a few key attachments I'm trying to break past, which is why I haven't been smoking, I haven't been drinking, I'm not fucking touching myself. I'm going to break the vicious cycles that I've created in my life. It's almost like if I do want to break the cycle of life and death, I have to show whatever it is that I am making the steps to break the cycles in my own life. I got a lot more stories. If anybody wants to hear anything specific, let me know. This is not the longest video in the world. I expected it to be long, but this is good. I'm happy with this. Yeah. Thank you and goodbye. I love you all.